I want to speak briefly about the simple constants of good cities, and I realize this is a contrarian but important idea, and the point I'm going to make here is that we will hear today, we've already heard today, about extraordinary aspects to do with the future. We've heard about all manner of things, about things that might happen, how the brain might change, how cities might change. And we will hear, I'm sure, over the rest of today and tomorrow about guided electric vehicles and free, clean energy, about what happens in the post-internet public space, about what happens when money has gone, certainly going, seems to be disappearing as we speak, and what's going to happen to the future of communications after newspapers, new newspapers, presumably. So what I want to do is effectively to argue that although these things are fascinating and important, that there are other things that are constants that are also going to remain important. So I want to talk about the things that never change. This is effectively undermining the whole purpose of the conference, but bear with me, so I think we'll get somewhere by the end. So, things that don't change, the things that we take for granted in cities, and which I'm going to argue will continue to be important in the years, centuries ahead. Things such as sewers. Just underneath here, you've got Bazalgette's fabulous cathedral-like sewer system that runs throughout London, built as a response, and it goes back to the question that was asked at the end of my colleague and friend Ricky Burdett's presentation about, well, what kind of makes these cities, these developing cities, move forward. It's a crisis that leads to the need for an intervention, some form of government intervention that will lead to the building of sewers, the provision of clean water in pipes, again, a bit traditional, a bit old-fashioned, but frankly very important. Telecommunications by wire, we've seen images up there of telecoms and the arrival of the telephone, but actually the question of what kind of fiber optic cables or beyond that deliver high-speed broadband remains incredibly important. Underground railways, the cities we've seen, Mumbai, Istanbul, others, Sao Paulo and others, are all building underground railways. Railways, Victorian technology in Britain, but which is being built into cities and indeed retrofitted into cities such as Paris and London as they extend their systems. And even the one thing I see in the street regularly outside my own home, and we all do this, people sweeping the street with brooms. If you want evidence of how things in the end don't quite move on, there are of course machines that do this as well, but streets being swept by people with brooms, evidence of how at some level cities don't change as much as we all imagine they do. But this is true for softer aspects of urban life. And what Susan Greenfield said, I think, precisely relates, or I'm going to say something that precisely relates to what she said. Coffee shops, Boswell, Johnson, and all of that, but all the way through to Australians bringing flat whites and Seattle giving us Starbucks. These are things, coffee shops are constant, places to meet in the great cities. Public squares and streets. We've seen pictures earlier on, Covent Garden, or the area around Covent Garden, originally built as elegant homes for the burgeoning, then aristocratic class, then becoming a fruit market, now a shopping centre. It will move on again, I can assure you. Clubs, restaurants and hotels, endlessly reinvented. They were all there hundreds of years ago, and they're still there. Clubs, long thought to be dying out in St. James's, now reinvented for the young and moving around the world from London as if it were a new idea. Department stores, one-off shops, consumerism, a marvellous form of socialised behaviour, but again, hardly changing in terms of the way streets function over centuries. And the same could be said about public safety, and particular about good domestic architecture. The idea that there are places in cities that people wish to live in and which attract the kind of people who can then drive forward ideas and who want to be present in the city precisely because there is somewhere attractive to live in it. You can see people moving around the world today precisely because of the high quality and decent domestic architecture in some cities, much of it, frankly, within a mile of this building. Now, and then of course there's urban mixing. The things, again, these are universals, constants in great cities. Things that architects and designers and academics seek to deliver today, things that have actually largely grown up by accident without all the analytical capacity we have today, but which we're now trying to use analysis to inform policy to allow these things to be built into new cities and new parts of cities. So everything from mass sporting events, spaces for political marches and demonstrations, museums, galleries, theatres and music, just look at the area in which we're located today, cinema, nightclubs and bars, long list of these things, everything down to the less discussable, you know, what I've written here on my note is nighttime entertainment districts, and all that that idea conveys, the naughty, the bad places that people want to go to at night, often now neon-filled, but which, frankly, you know, are there in Hogarth and indeed well before that. So I would argue that despite all of the real and imagined advances that are taking place all around us, that there's an underlying requirement that cities operate in simple and unchanging ways. So what people want, if they're going to exist in Mumbai, in Istanbul, Sao Paulo, in New York, Paris, London, Manchester, wherever, is reasonable personal safety. They need to feel that if they're in the city, however many millions of people they are touching as they move through the city, be it Mumbai or elsewhere, that they're reasonably safe in doing that. They need to have reasonably reliable infrastructure, sewers, water, and other utilities. That they have to have places to meet, to socialize, and to consume. They want places that they can meet together to do things collectively. I still am fascinated myself about the difference between watching a DVD at home and going to the cinema, and the improved experience that going to the cinema or going to the theatre is as compared with doing these things at home. So providing places to allow this socializing to take place, to allow us to do things jointly. And also, of course, to provide places to debate or demonstrate. You only have to look at the great cauldron of London as a place for debates and marches, and of course there'll be another great march next week. There are people encamped at St. Paul's making a political point. These things can only go on in certain kinds of environments, and they are not necessarily radically altered by the forward march of technology and so on. And of course, crucially, cities continue to provide opportunities for personal fulfillment. This great idea that the cloak of anonymity that cities so often provide allow people to move from other places to fulfill themselves, less troubled than they otherwise would be, and certainly less troubled than in smaller towns and rural areas by other people's judgment. And so the opportunities, the underlying opportunities that cities have for really more centuries offered remain constants to their continuing success and capacities. So what are the implications of all of this? Well, briefly, and this is where I really don't want to undermine the whole purpose of the conference, so I apologize once again. But cities, I would argue, are driven by people at least as much as, and arguably more than by technology. And at the risk of a cheap point, today's event, this event, makes this point personally. I mean, you have to ask yourself, why aren't we doing this by some sort of remote computer-based way, by Skype, where we could all have stayed at home, stayed longer in bed this morning and so on? Well, the reason is we're coming here because of all the opportunities of sensing how other people behave, being able to talk to each other in the breaks, listen to the way the chair and those organising are trying to corral the speakers, all of these things that make it a theatrical experience, a shared opportunity, which is very different from doing this, and Susan Greenfield, I thought, made this point excellently, doing this separately and at home. So there will be changing technologies, changing ideologies, changing social movements, and these will, in my argument, be shaped by cities rather more than they shape cities. So I'm going to argue that all the technological changes, all the things that we're going to hear, will shape cities, but the cities will also shape them, and possibly more so. So I'll just finish with the thought that cities will be driven by the interaction of people and basic underlying infrastructure even more than by the fabulous technologies, the fabulous changes that we're going to hear about today. Thank you very much.
For more big thinking about the future, go to iq2if.com.